Hello and welcome to Altitude. It's episode 4, our behind the scenes look at the world of air traffic control. I'm your host and Heathrow Air Traffic Controller, Ady Dolan. This month, we're looking towards the future and the role of research and innovation in aviation and air traffic control. Things like unmanned traffic management, automation, and artificial intelligence could all revolutionize ATC. But how do you go from the drawing board to operational reality in what is obviously a safety critical industry? I can think of no one better to help us explore that question than our very own Louisa Smith, who heads up NATS's research and development team. Hello, Louisa.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone.
And we've also got Gary Cutts from the UK Research and Innovation. He's director of something called the Future Flight Challenge. Hello, Gary.
Hello, everyone.
We'll be finding out a little bit more about what that is over the course of the show. As usual, you can submit your questions at the end, and over the next 30 minutes, we'll try and get through as much as we can. So, Gary, let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about your background, how you got involved in UK R&I, and what exactly that is.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ady. So firstly, an introduction to me as an individual. I've spent 29 years in what I would call large aerospace with Rolls-Royce, almost all in engineering across military and civilian products, covering the entire life cycle of engineering from concept design through to in-service management and safety management. The bulk of my career, in all honesty, has followed a couple of themes. One has been working at the interface of engineering and innovation and business, so finding kind of real business and, I guess, social benefits from some of the technologies. The second theme has really been about large-scale change, looking forward, looking to the kind of strategic and positive opportunities there are for us out of innovation and new technology. So that's me as an individual. I've been with UK Research and Innovation for approaching 2 years, which is kind of fantastical. Time has flown. I leapt across to lead the Future Flight Challenge. And the reason I did that is that the Future Flight Challenge, it's kind of a pivotal moment for us in UK RI. It is leading an aviation system transformation and innovation project that's driving all of the changes in that wider aviation system to allow the vehicles you'll have seen trailed widely, but these new classes of air vehicles, from drones to freight carrying UAS through to air mobility vehicles and beyond. So we're driving the aviation innovation across that wider footprint for us. So that's me and the organisation. UKRI itself is somewhat wider than that. It takes in all of the university research bodies in the UK, but also the government's innovation programme. So we work across that from academic institutions into government, into industry to drive this major transformation programme.
Wow. So Louisa, Gary talks there about transformation and change, and obviously in aviation, technological change is what it's all about. A massive job to be head of R&D at NATS. How on earth do you get into that role?
Well, it's a real privilege to be in the role, I would say. But I started my career in the RAF as an air traffic control officer, where I did both terminal, so traditional the tower controller position, as well as area radar as well. And then I joined NATS after about 5 or 6 years, I think it was, in the Air Force, where I was a research analyst within the R&D team. Following from there, I took a huge opportunity to be the executive assistant for the CEO, where it gave me the ability to understand how the business worked, how the company worked and operated, and then I came back to be the head of R&D following that. So I've been in the position for a few years now. I've had a year of maternity leave in amongst that as well, so coming back from maternity leave in lockdown was quite interesting, but it was a good challenge. But I lead a team now of just over 30 individuals who are, impress me every day with how clever they are and their knowledge and their skill sets and their technical technical expertise in research and innovation, and they're working on concepts to help look at what's going to happen in the future for aviation and for ATM.
So you speak about the future there, and you guys in both of your roles, you're always looking ahead at what's coming over the horizon. So for both of you, what are the big priorities for innovation in aviation for, say, the next 10 years? What's the big stuff that's coming? Gary, go for it.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about this as kind of I guess, a push and a pull answer. So from a technological point of view, I mean, so many technologies seem to be coming to a head to me right now. So in our world of new classes of vehicles, we're looking at a wide range of electrification technologies. So the electrical machines themselves, power electronics, batteries, battery power densities, and so on. But we also have people looking at the use of hydrogen for flight, so whole new propulsion power systems. But just as interestingly, in my world, the role of autonomy, the role of artificial intelligence, high power computing, and sophisticated sensors. How do we knit all of that stuff in? I could go on, but there's such a wealth of new technology. And as I said, I've worked in aerospace an awful long time. It is really high-tech industry, but it's incrementally high-tech. I genuinely think in the next 5 years, there's so many new technologies coming to bear in the industry, it could be a pivotal moment. I'd just like to jump to the opposite point before I hand to Louisa and talk about the pull as well, the sort of societal pull. I think there's a couple of dimensions here. The obvious one is sustainability. So, I mean, gone are the days where the industry can stand on a stage and say, well, aerospace is only 2% of the carbon generation, therefore it kind of should be left alone. The industry's moved way beyond that now. So we know the pressure is on to decarbonise transport. It's really hard to do that for aviation. We know it's a difficult industry to do that in, but it's not impossible. And so that pull from the public, I think, is dominant. How do we address that? The second element, I said I've referred to there, is the public demand for things that I don't think the public knows aviation is the solution to. So we talk a lot about this sort of instant gratification. People want permanently on 24-hour instantaneous delivery of goods. People have a demand for increased services. And we look and we think with some of the new classes of air vehicles, aviation could be a provider of some of those. So I think your average person who wants to have a 1 hour clicked delivery of goods may not be imagining that the middle mile or the last mile could be provided by an aircraft. So there's a real societal pull for things that aviation could address. So yeah, really exciting time.
Wow. And Louisa, what are your thoughts?
So I really would echo what Gary said. So automation is definitely something, and AI and those types of that area of research. And as Gary said, the integration of new airspace users. So as Gary mentioned, but also space as well. That type of area of work is very interesting for us, and to see what that will deliver. But again, I think it's around for ATM world, or for the world that kind of yourself and I live in constantly, is around how we achieve what we need to by looking at some of those targets, so sustainability, the environmental factors, how we reduce the environmental impact, predictability, and safety as well. Safety is at the heart of everything that we do, and is something that we will continuously look into and improve. And with new technologies, with AI, automation, that brings huge safety challenges with implementing some of those things. So those types of activities around research are really essential for us.
But this last year, I mean, surely COVID has just thrown a massive spanner into all of those fantastic projects. Has the focus changed at all, or are we still completely on target?
So Gary might have more of the facts behind it, but from kind of research that we've done, the impact on kind of drones, UAM, that's unmanned aircraft, or advanced air mobility, urban air mobility, those terms which people might be familiar with, they don't seem to be massively affected by the timelines that we're looking at already. So those timelines are around 2035, 2040 for some of those advanced air mobility or urban air mobility, or for some people who aren't familiar, flying taxis. Those timelines haven't really changed. And on the traditional airline traffic that we control constantly all the time, and you're obviously at the front face of that, whilst we still are very unclear about how quickly that traffic might recover, but we are expecting it to recover in the future, and we still need to be prepared for that.
Mm.
And perhaps, Ady, if I could add to that, from what we see in the Future Flight Challenge, I would probably go a little bit further than Louisa there, and say that what we see is, and it's quite complex, there have been some really positive unintended consequences of the pandemic. So the negative part first, Of course, we're working with an industry that's just been decimated financially. And we could spend all afternoon sharing some kind of heartbreaking figures of the number of jobs lost and the hundreds of billions that the industry will lose this year. So it's a really difficult time for that industry to engage in really innovative new concepts and technologies. And yet what we actually see is that even the large established players, their speech to us is that now is a really difficult time to engage, but the societal demand for change in aviation is probably heightened by the pandemic because people have not flown. People are starting to see for the first time carbon reductions and large-scale carbon reductions. So the public is kind of having this demand that says, that side of it we'd like, how could we carry on? The second thing for us is we work a lot with new entrants, small, and they're much more like tech companies than a typical aerospace company. And for those people, honestly, many of them see the pandemic as a trigger for faster change. They just see anything that upsets the status quo. Well, surely that's an opportunity for somebody to disrupt, to bring new technology, new innovation. So what we've seen in the Future Flight Challenge, we launched a competition, our first major competition for collaborative R&D funding in the middle of 2020. And the timing was perfectly awful. So we launched this competition and we were carrying a risk that what happens if we're undersubscribed? There aren't enough good ideas out there. And we got the opposite. We're oversubscribed by good ideas. So we saw far more people enter than we'd expected. And I will say, having talked to the Civil Aviation Authority as well, the Civil Aviation Authority's Innovation Hub team, they've seen more people applying to them with radical innovation ideas since the pandemic started. So yeah, it's a really complex picture. I'm more of an optimist. I think there's a real challenge for the industry to recover. I don't want to belittle that, but this moment as a trigger for much more rapid adoption of technology, that feels like where we are.
And I think, I think there's some real practical research that's going on at the moment, especially in the area that Gary's talking about, which is really relevant for people hopefully watching, which is around, transportation of healthcare. We've got research going on in that at the moment, and how can we transport things without the need and get things quicker to places. So some of those elements, it doesn't take far to look in this, during the pandemic, where some of those things, if they were in place, would have huge benefit for our current situation.
Louisa, maybe if I can just add to that, 'cause, thank you, that's a really good trigger. So in the middle of the Future Flight Challenge, we were running our normal program and we had a number of drone operators come and talk to us and say, we think we can do things directly to assist with COVID-19. So we managed, by hook or by crook, we managed to set up a quick program just to put money out there. We selected 14 projects that were typically of the 4 to 6 months. They are coming to a head about now, so kind of March, April timescale, and they were very much, as Louisa said, there was some that were looking at situational awareness for kind of managing, people being outdoors and things like that. The vast majority of them were looking at medical applications. So that whole field of use of drones for medical, and that's either moving samples around, moving drugs, getting drugs to far-flung difficult places. That's really interesting. And although, again, it's really tempting to say, well, kind of what's the real advantage of that over conventional transport? Let me give you an example. This is a really good one. So when you take medical samples for all causes, including COVID, in a UK context, where you have islands and remote communities, there tends to be like 1 round of deliveries per day. So you get the medical samples and they have to hit, say, an 11 a.m. slot to get there to be processed, to get results back the next day. We have people that we're funding looking at doing that by air into the islands and an on-demand service. So when there are samples, you fly, you pick them up, they go back. So you can almost have you can take a 24-hour out of a medical sampling kind of situation. So yeah, again, it's one of those where unintended consequences of the pandemic, people have instantly said, okay, how can we bring innovation to bear to help out? It's very lively.
It's fantastic, isn't it? It's a great opportunity. You mentioned there the Future Flight Challenge, and one of the questions that we always get asked operationally is around where we see ourselves in 20 years in terms of sitting on a flight without a human sat at the front at the controls, and when can we expect that to happen, and how is it going to happen?
I don't know. So I was going to say, I think the timelines are. There's lots of people with lots of different opinions. I'm sure mine and Gary's opinions differ on that. I think one of the huge things. So the two big areas, I guess, the technology needs to be created to be able to do that. But I think the societal acceptance and human acceptance of that is huge, and the demand for that type of vehicle would need to be there and needs to be there as well. So I think that's the societal, how comfortable would people feel like to get into a flying taxi and do whatever they need to do. It is an important one that really needs to be looked at, because that will have a huge impact on how much it's utilised.
Gary?
Yeah, if I can build on that, I mean, I think it's a really, really interesting topic, and it definitely puts people into camps depending on their backgrounds and belief system. And certainly from my time at Rolls-Royce, there were always some really interesting discussions between the pilot community and the engineering community. And it comes down a little bit to that, the kind of analytical making sense of data versus the educated, experienced human judgment. And the honest answer, every time you looked at that, you said they both play a kind of a sensible role. It changes over time, but there's a role for both in there. Certainly, if you look at the use of drones or more sophisticated unmanned air systems for goods delivery, they kind of make sense when you go to a reasonable volume. To go to that volume, that becomes quite a problem. Flying those vehicles. We'll come back to ATM later, no doubt, but flying those vehicles near to each other, near to urban spaces, how do you do that? And then you put air mobility vehicles on top, so in air taxi mode within cities. Quickly, personally, I get to a point where saying some level of autonomy will be an absolute enabler to enable that to happen at volume. I don't think it's inevitable it will cover every aspect. So I think we are on that journey, and it is a journey. And one of the problems we talked about in the early days of future flight was exactly that. How do we map out that journey? So today, for a drone, largely they're flown in visual line of sight. Most regulations dictate that a remote pilot has to see the drone. I would say it's not a leap of faith to say the technology could go way beyond that today. So we're right at the kind of baby steps of that. So you get to being kind of remote pilot for drone through without visual line of sight. Not a big step to make a small scale drone autonomous. So there are definitely implications. There are safety implications. There are people on the ground. You could fly that drone into live airspace. So it's not without risk, but it's sensible risk. I think then you're on that journey through to, in my world, augmenting pilot capability. So one of the bidders we talked with a while ago, one of their concepts was, I guess, sort of a pilot, but not as you know it. So in the future, will it be necessary to have a fully trained pilot who needs to understand everything about the aerodynamics and so on of his aircraft? Or do you just need to have somebody who is more deciding directionally where they go, what decisions do they take? Because the autonomous systems can take away the need to understand, control surfaces, movement, and so on. So I think you've got that journey to autonomously aided to getting into perhaps single pilot operations for large commercial transport. I think there's a big journey before you're really talking about people jumping on an aircraft that has no people on. I suppose a final thought, though, I think people have been jumping on trains without a driver for probably about 40 years or more. And I think in some places in the world, and we know where some of them are, there is apparently a driver on board that makes people feel comfortable that actually it is an autonomous vehicle with a driver on board. So I think people, that aspect of autonomy has probably been around for longer than we think. And I will leave you echoing Louisa's thought, which I think is the dominant thought here. Eventually, there's a journey. We'll have different views about whether we'll ever get there and how fast. But it's not a technological journey alone. It is all about acceptance of people and can we get them comfortable that we've designed the systems with the right kind of redundancy and we understand the role of human versus the role of the system well enough to let people be comfortable trusting autonomy. I think that public acceptance is probably the bigger deal.
So let's get into automation, and Louise, let's come back down to the ground and look at ATC. Would you suggest then that I'm going to be replaced by some Geordie cyborg at Heathrow Tower in the next few years?
It's good that you've asked that question. Lots of people don't like asking me that question. I think they're worried about what I'm going to respond and say. But as we've talked about, the automation is massively complicated, and arguably you use automation already, which you probably are familiar with, but people forget where automation is already. We have automation that our controllers use, like yourself, and actually the R&D team participated in European Skies research program. This is our program which brings together collaborative European research in the aviation space. We did some work on that, and actually you probably utilised this tool at Heathrow, which is time-based separation, which was implemented by NATS as a result of that research. So there are elements of automation in what we do already. The other thing is that there's probably tasks that you don't like doing, or that the human isn't particularly good at doing, that if we could automate those, that would be quite useful, and you probably would appreciate not having to do some of those tasks. But in reality, it is a huge leap, and there is a lot to think about. So safety is, as I said before, at the heart of everything we do, and the industry safety is just it's everywhere, and it's our kind of priority. And I think what a lot of people do is in this space try to reflect how the automation, automated cars, how that's relevant to aviation. And the real challenge there is that the safety is in my opinion, is significantly different. And if you look at 2019 statistics, so 27,000 people were injured or seriously hurt in road traffic accidents in the UK in 1 year. That would fill 180 Airbus 320s, which is the aircraft with 6 seats for people who are viewing. That's a lot, and that demonstrates to me how much we have to think about safety in the aviation industry. So for us to do something which is, in my opinion, way more complicated, because obviously it's 3-dimensional as well, and you can't just stop. If you're in a car, and an autonomous car, and it's not working, or you need something done, you could stop. That we don't have that in the aviation industry. We don't have that in ATM. So it is really complicated and complex. And just to go on to another point, what the human is very good at is dealing with ambiguity. And how do we create a system that can deal with that ambiguity will be very challenging. And the example of that is the Hudson River, which hopefully most people are familiar with. Actually, in simulations, how much you can run that example loads of times and it doesn't come up because it was a very unique incident. How do we design a system that can deal with that, which it's never seen before, come up with a solution, because the answer can't be, I don't have a solution. So we're a long way from that. But we do have tools and systems that help the controllers already. It's about whether you can create a system that takes that decision away from the controller, which we are significantly far away from.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, some of those tasks that we have to do now that are monitoring based tasks, and let's face it, humans are really pretty rubbish at monitoring. We tend to drift off and lose concentration. So that kind of work where we can take some of those tasks away to free up the human to kind of step back and look at the more decision-making elements of the job are really key. So that's great. And I know that we've been doing some work with the Turing Institute. So what have we been working on with them?
So the R&D team have been working with the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's data science and artificial intelligence. It's a government-led organisation which brings together university and academics. And we've been looking at how automation and artificial intelligence may impact the operations in the future. And it's something that we're keen to kind of continue working with them. And we're actually just at the moment looking at how we'll work with them in the future as well. We do have loads of collaborations going on. Obviously Gary's works on the future flight. NATS has been successful at bidding on some of the work programs in that area. So we're doing some work in there. And we also work on the European projects as well.
I mean, and Gary, you're at the middle of all of this, and let's face it, some of this stuff is absolutely massive. How important is collaboration to achieve any of this?
Yeah, I'm tempted to give a really trite answer and say collaboration is kind of everything. It really is. I came, as I said right at the start, I come from an aerospace background, and it was only when I came into this job that the distinction between aerospace and aviation became clear to me. And it's not subtle that it's you look at how we operate the aircraft and every aspect of that operation we have to have, it is a very complex field. For us in the future flight regime, we're at one level, it sounds like an aircraft thing. We're trying to push some new classes of aircraft into being. And I'm not going to spend too long on the future flight thing. That's one for another day. But we are taking in several pillars of things we look at. So for those new classes of vehicle, they clearly have to have a different air traffic management system and a different concept of airspace management. You can't deal with them today. The regulation isn't in place to allow them to fly in the way we imagine they will fly. We then clearly need some different concepts of airport. So an urban air mobility vehicle landing in a city, the whole idea of what people call vertiports, what are they? Then you've got, I'm going to stop in a moment, you've got the whole digital infrastructure that goes hand in hand with that. We talked about the role of autonomy. There will be some, but there will definitely be a need for connectedness in that system. So, you know, what cyber secure, redundant systems do you need to have of IT and communications that allows that system to knit together, and I could go on. So that sort of is the landscape of future flight, and we quickly became compelled that we have to change all of that, but they're all codependent. And it's not deterministic. We kind of don't know what the end point is. So we're kind of watching and nurturing this new emerging set of innovations. So the only way you can deal with that is by all of those people working closely together. And if I can just kind of finish off with kind of a story, I guess. So the start of Future Flight really was February 2020. Just over a year ago, we had a workshop in the middle of the UK with 130 organisations there, from all walks of aviation life. So I mean, literally all walks. So we had legal professionals looking at air law and the legal aspects of ethics in this, to software companies, to telecommunications companies, to aircraft and engine manufacturers and air traffic managers, and the whole range of that. It was amazing to watch that 2 days. It's probably one of the most vibrant couple of days I've spent in my career, to watch people talking to each other and going, oh yeah, no, I thought I'd got the really difficult technical piece in this. I thought your bit was trivial, but that's really difficult. So for me, in this space of future flight, I think it goes beyond that to new forms of aviation and aviation innovation. It's about all of those participants coming together and moving the industry on. So yeah, collaboration is kind of everything to us.
And I guess for you as well, Louisa, your contact book must be absolutely bulging with people from all over the industry.
Yeah, I think it's key for us to work with different partners, different organisations, because it is you don't do your role as a controller in isolation. It is a team effort, and it's a kind of a team effort outside of NATS as an organisation, and that's what we need to be focusing on as well. So collaboration is key for what we want to do in the future as well, and to, as Gary said, to advance some of these things.
Brilliant. So before we get into some questions, let's just end on this question to you too. If you could choose to change or improve one thing in aviation or in ATC specifically over the next 20 years, what would it be, and how feasible is that? Let's go to Louisa.
I would say that I think the environmental impact of the industry is obviously a big topic at the moment, but I think it's crucial, and I think it has been for a while. I mean, NATS has always had environmental targets around our operations, so I think that's something that we really need to look at as an industry as a whole, and how we operate and how we bring that down together collectively.
Gary?
Gosh, in some ways, Louisa, you've stolen my answer, but I'll add to it, and maybe add one more thing, which is a near-term thing. So the environmental challenge is really, really important. And as I said before, the aerospace and aviation industries, principally, it's a very mature, incremental industry, and which is not to belittle it at all. It's really hard to move things on in mature industries. I think we just need to get a bit more focus and a bit more money into the stuff that's a leap ahead of that. So rather than look at how do we take 0.5% off something next year, we need to be going, well, how do we take 40% of it 10 years from now? So I think that horizon of an ambition around sustainability is very important, and that is happening. If you look at what the UK government's been sponsoring with the Fly Zero programme, that's explicitly looking at the design of what would the concept design and the business case for a true green aircraft be? I think that's kind of things we should be encouraging. So really that's building on Louisa's. So I suppose I'm cheating and having two things to mind. What one thing would you do in the near term? And I will say openly, this is your specialism and not mine. But everything I read about the causes of, if you like, wasted fuel burn today, then operational optimization keeps popping its head up. Of something like 7, 8, 9% of fuel is kind of being wasted by operational optimization. Now, to me, knowing a little now after 2 years, but not so much about the whole air traffic management world, that feels like a relatively quick place to go look and say, well, how do we modernize our systems, give tools to you, Ady, and your colleagues that would allow us to kind of take some of that pure waste out of the system. So it's not a 20-year horizon thing. That's more a, could we do that in the next 2 to 3 years?
Okay. Excellent. Right, let's dive in here then. The first question we've got is from Nuno, who is from NAV Portugal. And he asks, considering that the COVID-19 crisis has led many ANSPs to reduce their investments, postponing or even cancelling projects, I asked, what is the recipe for building a more innovative, sustainable and resilient industry in the coming years, and where do our people fit into this? So, fastest finger first, whoever wants to go first on that one.
I would just say that actually some of the research programs that we're participating in, so the European ones that I mentioned, they're still continuing. There's no impact on those for the UK. So those things are kind of continuing, and obviously hopefully people will be aware now of some of the programs that Gary's kind of leading on that showcase that there is investment in these areas. But I would argue that actually now is more critical than ever to be innovative, and we do need to grasp that quickly, because we have got finite resources, and that's not just, that's across the whole industry given the pandemic and the impact of that. But that is when we need to be creative. That is when we need to be pushing the boundaries and coming up with new ideas. And I think the example that Gary gave right at the beginning around how we need to open the doors to allow other people to come up with ideas as well, and allow people to, it's not always the person who's the expert who might come up with a great idea. So we need to be more collaborative in that sense as well.
And if I could add to that, because I think that's a really good point, Louisa. I talk a lot about new entrants, smaller companies and so on. And so for the avoidance of doubt, I don't have a preference. I've worked in one of the biggest companies in aerospace for many, many years. But I think the two of those coming together is really important. So if I was an established company, and many ANSPs are, I would be going out of my way to say, what are they kind of, those novel partnerships, what people in adjacent technology are there who are probably quite small, move quite quickly and have good ideas that you could pilot with and do things quite quickly, because small scale and with more like a tech company mindset, some of those companies can move things forward in the 3, 6, 9 month horizon that the bigger companies would just take longer over. So yeah, that partnership across the industry, I think that's a good challenge.
Excellent. Next question is from Simon Brown, who asks, can you see an increasing role of the ATCO, that's the air traffic controller, becoming more of an exception manager and trusting the routine tasks to the computers and AI? So I think, Louisa, you touched on that earlier.
Yeah, so I think we mentioned it earlier about whether we should automate some of the tasks that you don't particularly like doing. I think it's hard to kind of establish what you really mean by exceptional manager. I'm sure in your time as being a controller that your role may have changed given different tool sets that come in. So it's quite hard to say how much things would change, but there are a lot of benefits of bringing automation in or something like that can provide safety, and that's when we would be looking to do it rather than to do it in just for the sake of doing it.
Yeah, I think at the moment, even when you look beyond the horizon, when you start listing out what those exceptions are in the current environment where there are so many humans and variables involved, it's really difficult to say, oh, well, there's only this many exceptions, so that's fine. So getting to the point where everything works on rails is as Gary's alluded to, probably requires us to think of a whole new different landscape rather than thinking in our current mindset of how we work today. And we've got lots of questions to get through, so I'm going to push straight on to ask Gary what he thinks of this. This is from Mike from British Airways. With UTM, how are we going to manage electronic conspicuity, common altitude references, and wake turbulence. That's a very specific ATC one for the man who doesn't work in ATC.
Yeah. So I'll have a go at a couple of bits of it that I might be able to give an intelligent answer on. So on electronic conspicuity, I think some variant of electronic conspicuity is essential. You know, the idea that as we get more and more crowded skies, then more crowded skies with, I think, greater range of novel vehicles. And a small thing we talked about a lot in the safety case work we've done, it may look quite different, whereas today the skies are largely filled by a small number of operators. You could be filled by tens of thousands more operators, you know, GA and beyond in this if the air taxi gets going. So with all of that complexity in there, I think we are just going to have to know what's in the skies. Now, whether that be independent tracking, so whether or not you've got electronic conspicuity, somebody's tracking you from, you know, origin to destination, so we know who you are, we will have to know that stuff. The system will just have to do that, and that will cause issues with some members of our communities for sure. There are people who are resistive. I think we need to get there. Wake turbulence. Gosh, that's a really difficult one, isn't it?
I was going to say I might be able to help you out, Gary, as I have I've got some wake turbulence experts in my team. I don't know if that helps.
Better at me, so I'm happy to hand that over to you, Louisa. Yeah.
Well, I haven't got the answer, but I was just going to say that it is something that needs to be carefully considered, because obviously, you know, the impact of wake is we understand that in the common environment, and Ady, you're probably far more aware of it than we are as well. But actually, some of these new airspace users, we do need to consider that. And when you start looking at urban air mobility, actually kind of impacts of MET around large buildings and on small drones needs to be considered as well. But again, that's something that the wider community need to look at as a whole.
Brilliant. We've touched on this one already, but probably get to tease a few more examples now. Ibrahim has asked, to what extent do you see disruptive innovation being able to come from new players in aviation versus needing to go via alliances with the existing dominant players? And I think, Gary, you've already mentioned some of the many smaller startups and tech companies who've come forward with some fantastic ideas.
Yeah, and there's definitely not one recipe for that, I will say. One of the things we did do in Future Flight, our last competition, we ended up splitting into two parts for almost a marketing reason. Let me describe that. So there was a perception in the industry that what we were looking for was the big players to come to bid to us. No matter how we described it, the smaller players went, yeah, but we know eventually you're going to select some of the big players. That's kind of what governments do. So we split it into two parts. We had a part that could only be led by SMEs. We didn't say they could only have SMEs in the consortium, but the lead had to be small. So that was to send a message that there's definitely a place for you. On the other half, where the consortia could be led by anyone at all, but your perception is it'll be led by one of the big players, we said you have to have an SME. So fundamentally, you know, there's ones that have to be SME led or ones that have to have an SME in them. So we're trying to drive that thinking there. My personal perspective, and I've given this answer a few times live, is that likely a good model is an established aviation player with a startup coming together, and I'm simplifying hugely here. Actually, it's a little bit of stereotyping, I guess, is that generally your newer entrants, smaller companies tend to be a bit more nimble, maybe more creative. It's not clear, it's not uniformly the case, but actually what you're doing is you're often entering in, as Louisa said very eloquently earlier on, to a very safety critical industry with an enviable safety record. And you mess with that at your peril. So we kind of think people partnering across that spectrum, people who understand the consequences, the way the system works, how to analyse it, make sense of it, and how to even create safety cases and so on. We think partnership is probably a really good model. I don't think it's the only model, for the avoidance of doubt. We have bidders in our consortium, and they will all become very public very soon, that are only small people, and they're moving on fast with really good ideas. I honestly do think that the role of new entrants, not just in aviation, but in all industries, is always a really important stimulator of change.
Absolutely. Let's go to Louisa with this one. Adam asks us, given the need to keep innovating, but I guess after the last 12, 18 months with really quite finite resources now and a real pressure on cost, where should the effort be prioritised to facilitate faster change? And are there any current activities that should just be parked?
It's quite a hard question to answer. I think prioritization of these activities probably happen at a kind of a company level, in the sense of each company needs to decide what their priorities are. But saying that, there probably should be, you have to, with a changing environment, readdress whether we're working on the right things, how we're working on those, and whether they are going to bring benefits, but also stopping projects if they're not providing the benefits that you anticipated, or potentially aren't required anymore. So it is quite a tricky question to answer. But I would say that we have seen a clear direction from government, for example, on the sustainability, on the environmental stuff. So we do get some direction in that level, which obviously will bring the community together.
Mm. And you'd say, Gary, then that sustainability is something that really now is risen right to the top in terms of what we're trying to achieve, and we've basically got a blank canvas to really go for it.
We have, and to be honest, in the Future Flight Challenge, one of the problems we have is that we've sort of got two overarching drivers. One is sustainability, and one is better mobility, better services, better connection, and depending on which audience we're talking to, people hear one or the other of those, but they're both really important. As we're talking better connectivity, again, I get really passionate about this. Aviation, to do things we don't even do today, to connect people in different ways and provide services. We're always saying, but in a sustainable fashion. So I think that whole concept of sustainability does run throughout all of this.
Absolutely. A quick look at the return of traffic. So a question from Saifullah, who asks, IATA has projected that the air traffic levels will return to pre-COVID levels by around 2023, potentially. Are there any ways that the aviation industry could accelerate this process to recover even sooner? Nobody wants to answer that one. Let's go for it.
Well, go on. I think that's quite hard. I mean, I'm sure there is a whole list of things that are outside my knowledge. I know people have been looking at biosecurity mechanisms and so on. So what is it that allows governments to allow people to travel? What is it that allows people to have the confidence to travel? So I'm absolutely sure there are mechanisms. I suppose I'm going to throw a challenge back out there. This is meant to be quite an open forum, and say every time someone says, how long is it until things get back to the way they were? I'm always minded to say, what if they never do? What if there's a trigger for change? So I'm throwing this out there for the avoidance of doubt as a question, not as a fact. If in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, we could get ourselves a truly green aircraft, truly green, that had not massive capability, maybe it's 50-seater, 1,000 nautical miles range. What if we had that and the travelling public has finite resources? What do you think might happen? And I can just imagine that the pattern of flight could change as a result of new technology being available, a changing public perception of sustainability and the importance of it. And then if we're really honest, the bit that our industry doesn't want to hear, a whole load of people have just got used to remote working. All the people, me included, who used to say aviation is absolutely essential, we can't operate without it, have just operated without it. So I'm not negative on that, but I would just say we should be thinking about what are the ways in which demand might come back different to before. It may not be a question of how does it come back being the same.
I think I'll just add on that one that I think the last year has shown us all that we can't really predict anything. We have to be prepared for the unexpected, and we have to, we might be looking at stuff or technology in 10 years' time that we don't even know exists at the moment. We don't even know the terminology or the phrase or anything like that. So how we develop or kind of going back to kind of the research area of it, how we deliver something that it doesn't become obsolete in the future is a real challenge, and that is critical as well, because artificial intelligence, I know it's been around for a long time, but some other stuff like blockchain, things like that, are not for our industry, are quite new technologies to be looking at.
Yeah, and I'll just give Gary, our guest, the last word at looking at this blank canvas. And do you see this as a real potential for actually, from this really dark period that we've had, to actually have some really good positive outcomes?
Absolutely. I said at the outset, I think I'm an optimist. I've seen nothing to stop me being an optimist after 31 years now in this industry. I think if in 5 years' time we look back and all we've done is get the industry back to being exactly the same as it used to be, we'll think that's a massive missed opportunity. This is a great moment to go and do some really big things, and we have tons of innovation and technology opportunities around us to do exactly that.
Excellent. Louisa and Gary, thank you both very much indeed. The future certainly does look very exciting. I hope you've found that as interesting, as fun as I have. And that is a wrap for the 4th episode of Altitude. But we will hopefully be back next month with more interesting stuff. So please keep an eye on NATS's social media channels for that. If you've got any feedback or any ideas for future topics that you'd like us to discuss, then please get in touch. You can email us at info@nats.co.uk, or you can tweet us @nats. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.